Welcome back, everyone. By now, many of you have probably heard that Texas may look to secede from the Union. This is a new movement now called Texit. And to speak with us about this, we have Daniel Miller. He's with the Texas Nationalist Movement, and he's going to talk to us about his push to make Texas leave the Union. Now, Daniel, real pleasure having you on.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
So I think a lot of people would have a lot of questions on how this would work, but I think let's start off on how this movement started. Now, I know this is not a new thing for you.
Right.
You've been pushing this now since '96. What has changed between '96 and now?
Well, I'll tell you, there's been a lot. We could talk about how the federal government, the case against the federal government has just gotten worse. We could talk about the increased erosion of our rights and liberties and, frankly, the sovereignty of our state, the destruction of our ability for local self-government. But what really changed in the movement was it was a very conscious choice on the part of those who supported Texas independence to found an organization called the Texas Nationalist Movement that was based on what we had seen happening around the world. You know, at the end of World War II, there were 54 recognized countries around the world, and by the end of the 20th century, there were 192. Those countries did not fall from space. The earth did not get any bigger. They were people in countries or areas that were just like us in Texas that said, look, we just want the ability to govern ourselves the way that we want to be governed. So, looking at examples of that around the world, we made a very conscious decision that a political movement, a political and social movement needed to be formed. And in 2005, that happened. And so since 2005, we've been able to, as the federal government obviously has made things worse, we've been able to engage our case just like any social or political advocacy organization and take our case straight to the people. You look at polling back in 2005 when we started, and any of those polls that were done back then, support for Texas independence was in single digits. But then you look at our on-the-ground work from that point to 2009, you had half of Republicans, about 45% of independents, and 15% of Democrats. Now remember, it's 2009, say that they believe that Texas would be better off as an independent nation. So you see that people were thinking about it from that standpoint.
Wow, that's a pretty good margin actually for you. And what is your estimate in terms of support right now? I understand Texas is a red state and
Right.
people aren't happy with the election. How do you think this has changed things?
Well, look, we wouldn't be pushing for a referendum if we didn't think we could win it. The fact of the matter is that we put this thing to a vote. We anticipate we're gonna slam dunk it by 10 to 15 points, maybe more. I think it really depends on exactly what the federal government does between now and the time the vote happens. Does anyone anticipate that they're going to reverse course and suddenly say, you know what, Texas, we get you, we understand your concerns? No, what we're going to get is we're going to get more jobs killed through the Green New Deal. We're going to get more centralization, more socialism, more power sucked into Washington, D.C., and we're going to see the rights of the people of Texas eroded and trampled on. When they're talking about, taking someone like Beto O'Rourke who said, hell yes, I'm going to take your AR-15, right? And when they take these radicals that are in Congress and say, look, we're going to put them in charge of your health and your economy and energy and all of these things, then the people of Texas, we know exactly what we're going to expect. So yes, we'll win by 10 to 15 percentage points and possibly more, depending on exactly how radical Washington, D.C. gets.
Now, what is the first step with this? I understand there's going to be a vote. How does this actually work?
Yeah, it's a process question. We get a lot of those, as you can imagine. But I would just encourage people to look and see what happened in Scotland in 2014, in the UK, and the Brexit vote. It's a very similar situation. For us here in Texas, we don't have citizen initiative. So we can't, no matter how many signatures we collect, we cannot force something on the ballot. But what we have to do is we have to engage these legislators, and we need a statute in place that will allow us to go to the polls and vote for that. Now, good for us, State Representative Kyle Biederman, being the hero that he is, filed HB 1359, which will do exactly that thing. So we make it through the legislature. Texans will go to the polls in November of 2021 to vote on the issue of Texas leaving the Union.
Now, I know with Texas, it's in a unique position as opposed to other states in the U.S. And with the Texas Declaration of Independence, I understand, for example, it actually talks about Texas being able to leave if the standards of government, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness are not upheld. I understand also that after the Civil War, that there was a new regulation put in for states saying that they had to have a state-by-state vote or basically have to win it through revolution if that's going to happen. How's this work?
That's not it at all.
I see,
and there's a lot of misinformation about that, so don't feel bad.
Okay, yeah, tell me.
Yeah, I got you. So here's what it boils down to. What we know is the United States Constitution in Article 10 lists out all the things that states are prohibited from doing. There's no prohibition against a state withdrawing. It's not in the Constitution. In addition, it says specifically in the 10th Amendment that any powers not given to the federal government by that Constitution are reserved to the people and to the states. So what we have to look at is, from a constitutional standpoint, is what the Texas Constitution says. Now, people want to talk about Texas versus White, that Supreme Court case, and I would love to absolutely slaughter that for you. And we can get there if you want to. But the bottom line is, what's important is our post-Civil War Constitution. Article 1, Section 1 ends with the words, "The perpetuity of the Union depends on the right of local self-government unimpaired to all the states." I don't know of anyone here in Texas that would agree that our right of local self-government hasn't been impaired. So then what becomes operative is Article 1, Section 2. Okay? And that is what I believe to be probably the purest expression of the right of self-determination in a governing document to ever exist. And it's existed in every form of our Constitution since the Republic of Texas days back in the 1830s and 40s. And it says this: "All political power is inherent in the people, and all free governments are founded on their authority and instituted for their benefit. And the people have at all times the inalienable right to alter, reform, or abolish their form of government in such manner as they may think expedient." So it's not a question for the federal government or for the other states. This is not a mother may I situation. It is a question that is left solely to the people of Texas. It is a political question, and it's a question that we hope to put to them in a Texit referendum.
You mentioned this Texas versus White. I'm not familiar with it. Tell us about this and what the arguments are with it.
You're a lucky man. So many people here in Texas, well, the Supreme Court said. You know, that's what they think that Texas versus White was the end all be all, and they ignore the fact that the Supreme Court is very often wrong about things, has to go back and correct it. But essentially what it is, it was a Reconstruction era Supreme Court case that a lot of these people use to say that Texas can't leave or that Texas needs the permission of the states. Well, it's one or the other, right? So which one is it? Well, that's part of the problem. Part of the inherent problem with Texas versus White is, number one, the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Salmon P. Chase, had actually been treasurer under President Lincoln, and so he should have recused himself. But beyond that, his opinion that he wrote was so far out of bounds for what the case actually dealt with. And he was, in effect, legislating from the bench. So much so that you had legislation introduced by northern legislators that was essentially, because of this case, that was calling for an ultimate ban, a reservation on the political power being held in the legislative branch and rebuking the Supreme Court for making the decision. Be that as it may, the opinion itself is absolutely hideous. It's internally contradictory, and I already highlighted part of that. He says that the Union is a union comprised of, it's an indestructible union comprised of indestructible states. And he says, so we have this indestructible union, we have indestructible states, but somehow West Virginia exists. So apparently the states aren't indestructible. But what about this indestructible union? Where does he get that from? Well, he makes this assertion that the United States Constitution is not a governing document in and of itself, that it's merely an amending instrument to the Articles of Confederation. Well, if you follow his logic and you say, okay, Salmon P. Chase, you got us there. Well, then what he did was he just invalidated George Washington's first term, okay? So, because by the time Washington was elected president of the Constitution, 2 states still hadn't joined, and everything under the Articles had to be unanimous. So then you move on to that ridiculous notion, and you say, okay, how does he make that connection? Well, he makes it by saying that, well, the Articles of Confederation said that it was a perpetual union, which we obviously find out because, you had 9 or 10 states have to secede out of the Articles of Confederation to form the actual union under the U.S. Constitution. But beyond that, he says that because the words perpetual union are in there, and the preamble to the U.S. Constitution says it's to form a more perfect union, that somehow he figured out that the founders devised a way to make perpetual even better. perpetual 2.0, right? But what you find is that people that start dealing with this issue, they neglect the fact that he says typically, or he says in there that states can leave, after he says that it's perpetual and they can't leave, he says they can leave by permission of the other states, consent of the other states is the phrase he uses, or revolution. Well, it's like, wait a minute, I mean, that just got a little extra, right? So you know, so he contradicts himself inside the document. But more importantly, and this is where the opposition who love to use Texas versus White always wind up on the losing end of this argument. For them, the world stopped spinning on the issue of self-determination in 1869. But for people like us, the world kept spinning. Supreme Court kept ruling, including the one in Jacobson v. Massachusetts, where it said that the federal government can derive no powers from the preamble to the Constitution. So they utterly cut the legs out from under his entire decision, because his entire decision on this issue was predicated on that belief. So Texas versus White is garbage.
Very interesting. Now, what is the argument to leave the Union? Imagine now, I'm a Texan, I'm here, and I'm wondering, okay, not sure what the future of Texas or America is. What do you tell me?
Well, I could tell you just to turn on the news, right? I mean, we could go there. But look, it's interesting, because people want us to sort of come out and say, hey, this is why we should leave the Union. And what we feel is it's an intensely personal decision, right? Everyone has their reasons or rationale. But I will tell you that throughout the years, what we have seen are some common threads. People in Texas are sick and tired of living under 180,000 pages of federal laws, rules, and regulations that, if you printed them out and stacked them, would be taller than the San Jacinto Monument. That's the monument to our victory against Santa Anna and our independence from Mexico. And think of that situation when you put it in those terms and realize that we fought a war to be independent from a dictator, but yet the laws, rules, and regulations that it administered upon us, or forced upon us by 2.5 million unelected bureaucrats, dwarfs our monument to our victory for independence. I mean, it should be troubling to anyone, but that's just one aspect of it. Texans are really just sick and tired of being told how to live their lives by a bunch of unaccountable federal bureaucrats. When we have real issues here in Texas related to the border and immigration and so many things that, that nation states of right should, have to deal with, we can't justify overpaying $103 to $160 billion annually into a federal system. That's money we'll never see again. That is the negative economic equivalent of a Hurricane Harvey event hitting Texas every 9 months. I mean, it's like going to a doctor, the doctor drawing all of the blood out of your body, spilling about 40% of it on the floor, re-injecting the rest of it, and then saying, hey, you realize you wouldn't be alive without me, right? I mean, that's how this relationship is. And so, our case is quite simple, but what we do is we boil it down for every Texan out there, and we say, look, we're tired of having to make the case for Texit. We're tired of having to make the case for Texas independence. So we're going to let you make the case for why Texas should be in the Union. And we ask them this question. If Texas was a free, independent, self-governing nation right now, right? We had our own army, we had our own control of our own borders, our laws were all made here. We had our own embassies overseas, we had our own passport, we had our own currency. In every respect, we were a self-governing, independent nation. And this debate was not about Texas, but this debate was whether or not we should join the Union. What would your vote be? And what would your case be? And it's fun to watch people flip that switch and realize that they can't list really a single reason why they would join the Union right now. I mean, think about how unappealing that is, right? Immediately, 180,000 pages of federal laws, rules, and regulations. Immediately, almost $30 trillion worth of debt. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So if you can't make a case for why Texas would join, why would you ever try to make a case that we shouldn't leave?
Now, to what extent is the model for Texit based on Brexit?
Yeah, it's there are a lot of similarities. There are some similarities, I think, probably between a mix between Scotland, the UK, and maybe even the Catalans, but with less unofficial referendum, right? But we see those similarities in dealing with independence movements around the world. Obviously, the common thread is that of self-determination, but ours is very similar. I mean, if you look at the arguments, say on the Brexit debate, very similar arguments: an uncaring bureaucracy in Brussels, a massive overpayment that could better be used at home and reallocated at home. That centralization of power in Brussels that threatens to erode the personal rights and liberties of British. I mean, those are very similar. And, we see similar arguments, especially with the movement in Catalonia, where their argumentation against the Spanish central government, when we first got, personal story, when we first got in touch with that coalition, they sent over some of their material that they had translated into English. And amazingly enough, the case that they were making against the Spanish central government, you could have crossed out the proper names and put Texas and put Washington, D.C. in their place, and we could have used it to go out and recruit Texan supporters. I mean, that's how similar a lot of these are. We see it there. We see it with the Sao Paulistas in Brazil. And we see some of the same complaints, especially related to immigration and the border, oddly enough, from fledgling independence movements in the northern Mexican states. So, a lot of this is, we understand that while we're fighting this fight in Texas right now, that it's really part of a much larger movement around the world to reclaim the right of self-government from a bunch of political elites who think they know what's best.
And Texas has an interesting history with this too. I was actually talking to a friend who's a good historian on, U.S. and Texas.
Right.
He was telling me interesting things about Santa Anna taking over in Mexico, actually. That, for example, he did a ideological purge of the military soon after taking power. He tried taking people's weapons away.
Yep.
You had him for, there was suspicion of voter fraud, for example. Many of the same issues a lot of conservatives are especially concerned about right now.
Sure.
Texas had actually faced under Santa Anna and under the grounds of them declaring their independence from Mexico. Actually, some of those same narratives from what my friend was telling me could be applied now. Do you agree with this, and to what extent?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I agree with it, but isn't that really sort of part and parcel of the history of mankind's struggle with how to govern one another? The desire by corrupt men and women to impose their will upon people, and people that typically just want to be left alone. They want to be left to their own devices, and they want to be able to govern themselves in the way that they want to be governed. And so, yeah, I mean, there was definitely some incongruity. When you had Santa Anna and, enacting his edicts that ran counter to the grain of the sons and grandsons of the American Revolution that were populating, that had been invited there to colonize. We're seeing that exact same thing. I mean, we're seeing an imposition of neo-Marxist doctrine, crazy science, if you want to call it that. We're seeing all of these really crazy dogmas and doctrines that are taking root in Washington, D.C., and have for a very long time, right? No one should pretend like this is a brand new occurrence. The power that has been centralized in Washington, D.C. has made it ripe for the control of radicals and ideologues. So the moment that they get control of it, they can wield it. I told someone the other day, they were, one of our politicians in Texas government was fawning all over and congratulating Joe Biden, and the guy was ostensibly a Republican. And I thought, well, that's odd, because if a man had just spent the last year going around telling everybody that had a pair of ears that he was going to burn my house down, I wouldn't be applauding and congratulating him on being able to get a packet of matches. But that's in essence what we're looking at. They made the promise. They went for a year and said what they were going to do, and frankly for more than a year, right? That's just the public campaign. So here we are as Texans at a very strong decision point. If freedom and liberty and rights and rule of law and prosperity and opportunity and all the things that make Texas Texas, if those things matter to us, then as Texans we're at a very pivotal decision point. We've got some choices that we're going to have to make, and one of those choices involves us reasserting our status as an independent nation.
When it comes to the basis again of seceding from the Union, if you do manage to do it, of course, part of that is based on the idea of whether or not politicians are still holding the foundations of the Constitution,
Yeah.
I understand, and also on whether they're still serving the basic function of government, protecting life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Right.
Based on that argument of seceding, what is the basis of government, how has government gone against the Constitution and against life, liberty, pursuit of happiness?
Well, let me address one thing before we get to that question, and that is this term secede, okay? And I understand why so many people want to return back to it, because that was the term that was very prevalent back in the 19th century. Mm-hmm. When I woke up this morning, it was the 21st century, so I like to think we're a little more evolved, and we're looking at this through a much clearer lens than in those days. But I think that as we have seen in the last 70 years, the term secession has come to mean the withdrawal from a political body, typically an incorporated political body. And that's not what this is. What we're essentially talking about is withdrawing our membership from a political and economic union, and from that aspect of an absolute political and economic union that no longer serves our interests. In that regard, it's very much like the UK with the European Union, right? And it all depends on what your viewpoint of the union is. If you believe that it is an absolute centralized government and that the United States is a nation state that has sovereignty and the states are just merely administrative subdivisions, use the word secession to your heart's content. But if you believe that the union was founded with a very limited federal government and a very limited scope, which is very limited political an economic union, a mutual defense compact, a postal union, a currency union, those things that we see around the world right now, all days, between self-governing independent nation states. If you believe that that's what the founders intended, which is exactly what they founded, the founders and framers, then withdrawal, exit, is exactly the term that you want to use. So not to quibble over words, but it's important, that we get the terminology right, because the opposition loves to change the dictionary on people. They love to skirt a debate by just shifting the words, and that's an important one. So, so to your point though, now that I've gotten that off my chest, but really to your point, this issue that you asked about related to where is that incongruity that's fueling this, if I remember, that's what you were asking. It's all over. We're looking at a people here in Texas that believe in a constitutional republic with a very fundamental set of rights that are not given and taken away by government. And at a fundamental level, that's what they sense out of Washington, D.C. that has gone wrong. They're seeing the opposite of that. We've seen it time and time and time again. And I think Texans at their very core are just tired of having to wake up every day and fight for something that they were born with. I think it's really just a matter of, I guess if you want to go back to your discussion a moment ago about the colonists rising up against Santa Anna, you look at the Battle of Gonzales, the home of the inaugural voyage of the Come and Take It flag, right? When the Mexican army came and wanted to take this little bitty cannon that was given to them for self-defense, they had such an attachment to the right to keep and bear arms that they said, no, you're not going to take it. Well, that's where we are here in Texas. And the best way to avoid having to get into those situations is for us right now to engage in this process of reasserting our status as an independent nation.
Just last question.
Sure.
If you were to tell people, just average Americans, anything in terms of what you're trying to do with Texas, what your movement is about, what would you tell them?
Well, look, our organization was founded to secure and protect the political, cultural, and economic independence of Texas. We have seen it under threat from the very jump. There is a misconception that our organization is exclusively about the Texas issue, and granted, it is a huge issue for us because it solves so many of the challenges, so much of the fighting that we have to do for our political, cultural, and economic independence. That threat comes from the criminals on the Potomac River, those who couldn't find the Constitution if you taped a copy of it to their face. So you know, we have engaged in many campaigns related to not just Texit, but our cultural preservation. You know, the fact that you've got folks that are coming in now and wanting to indoctrinate or change the Alamo story to fit a neo-Marxist progressive rhetoric. You know, we just had to fight a battle against our own state board of education because they wanted to remove the references to the Alamo defenders as heroes. I mean, that is absolutely ridiculous that in this day and age, we would have to go fight our own state board of education to prevent them from scrubbing the word hero out because they said that the word hero was value charged and it was a value judgment. It's like, where do they come up with this stuff? But that's where the fight is. It really stems back to what I told you we did when we founded the Texas Nationalist Movement, which is as we looked around the world at movements that had gotten their independence, we saw that they had to have all three. They had to secure their political, their cultural, and their economic independence, because if they didn't, they would wind up right back under the thumb of some external power, some external control. So it was important for us to engage this fight on all three. So Texit is a part of what we do, but our organization will have a far longer life beyond this, simply because we know that once you gain independence, there are those people out there that, and the Brexit issues are perfect. They are a perfect lesson for this. But we know that there are people out there right here in Texas that will do everything they can to put us right back under those connections. So win the Texit vote, win the transition, install a constitutional republic right here in Texas, and a government that is here to serve the needs of its people and to make Texas this self-governing, independent bastion of economic freedom and personal liberty.
Hey, Danny Miller, thanks again for being on Crossroads.
Hey, thank you.